floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks for that kind introduction, and thank you to Volodya for inviting me to be here. It's a real pleasure to be in such a distinguished group and to meet everyone here. So I'm very happy to be able to join you. This paper is a joint piece of work with John Reuter, who many of you know, who's a specialist on Russian politics, and with Dave Armstrong, who is an Americanist who we're trying to teach more interesting things about the world to. So that's the team. We start with this paper, like most papers on Russian politics, by talking about Egypt. Hosni Mubarak was once a young, charismatic leader who took over a country in disarray, somewhat unexpectedly, and then gradually consolidated his authority, and became, over time, the increasingly bloated face of durable authoritarianism. Not that brings anyone to mind for a Russian audience. Mubarak was ultimately overthrown by a coalition. He was overthrown by groups, networks that brought together the grievances of urban industrial workers, of students, of lawyers, of dentists. Don't upset the dentists, this is very important. And a whole broad range of different civil society actors who came together in the so-called Days of Rage to bring down the regime. And the events in Egypt, we understand pretty well, are quite typical of the so-called urban civic revolutions that we've seen throughout the colored revolutions being a good example, but in many countries throughout the world in the 21st century. Mark Beisinger has done some interesting work documenting the shift in the nature of revolutions over time. And these urban civic revolutions that we see are essentially revolutions of coalitions, often negative coalitions, people disgruntled for different reasons with the regime, but the one thing they can agree on is that they need a change of leadership. This phenomenon is increasingly common and well understood, in the sense that we understand that these are cross-class coalitions, cross-group coalitions, but what we don't understand very well yet is where those coalitions come from. When is it that these different groups with different priorities and different grievances are able to get together and coordinate on a strategy to bring down the regime? What are the origins, the prehistories, if you like, of these revolutions? And I think this is particularly important in Russian politics, where in fact we actually see lots of protest, typically on issues that are very local in nature, and in which it's very difficult to provide bridging frames to create movements that will bring together groups across different issues. And so that's what we're trying to study here today. What is it? What are the conditions under which different groups start to coordinate their activities against an autocrat? The existing research on protest coordination is not very helpful in this regard if you're trying to understand when different groups will start to coordinate their strategies, as they did in Egypt and elsewhere. Most of the existing literature on coordination is about individuals and about the incentives of individuals to join protests that are already going on, or to coordinate around sort of big events like funerals or elections. There's been an enormous, some of this work dates back to the collapse of the USSR. It's been reborn, if you like, in recent years with studies of communication technologies that allow people to observe each other's behavior in much greater detail than they did before. Whether those technologies are cell phones, or whether it's social media like Facebook or Twitter. And so there's been kind of an explosion of the study of individual level decisions to join ongoing protests or not. And this is interesting and it's important, but it's kind of led us away, I think, from the sort of foundational moments of these kinds of protests, which are essentially, we now think in terms of these leaderless mobilizations, when in fact mobilizations are very rarely leaderless at all. In fact, they're if anything, leader-full, right? They represent different groups coming together, coalitions that bring their supporters onto the streets at the same time. And we know that especially in sort of more authoritarian contexts, when the regimes like to push back against protests, that organizations are really important in providing continuity and coordination of protests over space and across time. So in this paper, instead of taking the sort of leaderless perspective, we're interested in trying to understand groups very specifically. And we focus on one of the most common setup, one of the most common forms of authoritarian regime in the world today, and that's regimes in which you have different kinds of opposition that are operating within the polity. And this is a classical situation, if you like. You have some groups who are actually allowed to participate in official institutions. We call them the systemic opposition. In Russia, obviously, this is the Communist Party and LDPR. And then you have other groups, sort of non-systemic opposition groups that are allowed some scope for political organizing, but that scope is very limited, and they're often harassed and repressed and kept outside of official institutions. And what we're interested in, and regimes often work very, very hard to keep these two different sets of actors apart, right? They have very strong incentives to prevent there being a coalition between these systemic actors and the non-systemic actors. And so the question we ask in this paper is, what are the conditions under which systemic actors will actually be tempted to join in, to participate in, to throw their lot in with the non-systemic opposition? And so we think about this in terms of basically largely from the perspective of the systemic opposition. There's a bunch of different ways you could cut this, but we sort of in the paper think about the costs and benefits to coordination to the systemic opposition and when they're going to want to take this risk. And the costs the benefits rather of coordination are pretty obvious. The currency, if you like, of protest, as Charles Tilly told us a long time ago, is what he called worthiness, unity, numbers, and commitment, right? And so the more people you have on the street protesting at the same time, the more different kinds of people you have on the street, the more you're able to demonstrate both to the regime and to potential supporters that you have these qualities, that you have worthiness, unity, numbers, and commitment. So there are pretty strong incentives to coordinate for the systemic opposition. On the other hand, there are clear costs, right? And there are clear costs, particularly, the costs that apply to everybody, which are the kind of ideological and political control issues that you introduce when you share power with somebody else. But then there's also the fear of punishment by the incumbent regime. After all, you're being kept as a systemic opposition on a fairly short leash, typically, and so they're going to try and balance off these different considerations. And so the argument that we make is basically when are the costs when are the benefits rather of coordinating going to be higher than the costs? And so we make two arguments in the paper. One is about benefits and one is about costs. The benefit argument is essentially that the benefits of coordinating with opposition are really high if the grievance that's being expressed in the protests by non-systemic actors is something that's really important to your core constituents, right? If this is something that really goes to the heart of your identity as an organization. If that's the case, then you're going to want to participate in order to maintain your credibility as an opposition, right? If you're not willing to take action when the core interests of your constituents are at stake, then when are you going to take action, right? So you have to be willing to do that. You also want to do that in order to prevent poaching by other organizations, by these non-systemic organizations moving on your turf. And you're also going to want, from the regime's perspective, part of your job is to make sure that you help to manage protests, right? So you want to get in there and prevent actions that are underway from developing a kind of spontaneous, unpredictable, wildcat, if you like, kind of dynamic. So those are the kinds of issues on which you're going to want to coordinate with the non-systemic opposition. On the other hand, you're going to be more constrained in your willingness to coordinate when you're heavily co-opted, when you're very, very kind of tied together with the regime in terms of sort of perks and the benefits of office. In those cases, you're much more constrained in your freedom of action. So those are the basic arguments, and then we take those arguments and we think about Russia. Russia is fabulous in so many ways, but one of its ways is that it's an authoritarian regime or a hybrid regime with relatively open information, so we can actually observe quite closely what's going on the ground, and it has lots and lots of regions. And the lots and lots of regions allows us to make subnational comparisons between different regions, which allow us to hold national context, the institutions, all those different kinds of things that might be factors of variation constant, and then look at some more fine-grained issues. And so just analytically, this gives us a lot more leverage. So what we did is we collected data on protests by the systemic opposition, by the Communist Party. We used their website, and we generated a list of around 4,000 protest events from 2011 through 2012. And then using the IKD.ru, we created a data set also of what we call non-systemic opposition parties. Now, this is not the whole of the non-systemic opposition, is a very general term, but these are sort of broadly leftist type organizations that are going to be ideologically pretty similar in some ways to the Communist Party, and so present a kind of nice analog outside of the system. And we generated a data set of some 5,000 protest events over the same period. So then, and our hypotheses were that we were going to have, as I remember, it said grievances are going to drive this, and co-optation. So grievances we measured by essentially coding the original demands that are made at these protest events. We wrote down what exact specifically people were asking for, and then kind of in an inductive way generated categories in which to lump them together in order to get some manageable things for analysis. And we coded them into material, security, civil rights, politics, which is really about kind of positions, really specifically, elections, foreign affairs, environmental, and then a residual category. And we argued that, remember, it's going to be a core interest. So if the Communist Party it's really about material motivations. It's really about bread and butter type issues. And so we would expect to see more coordination when material interests are at stake, when that's what the demands are being expressed. And less coordination when things like civil rights issues, the things that matter, political rights, the issues that matter to the non-systemic opposition, but which the communists are not so infringed or impacted by, are at stake. And so we should see this contrast between these two kinds of issues. And then in terms of co-optation, what we did was we measured we looked at each of the regional legislatures, and every one of them that has a communist in an office within the regional legislature, either in a senior leadership position. We consider those to be ones that were heavily co-opted, and that's roughly about a third of convocations in the regional legislature in the time that we look at. And so we argue that we're going to see less coordination in those kinds of places. So if we just get the data together and think about demands, we see some sort of first indication that some of these thoughts are, and what we're going to do is go through sort of three different ways of looking at this that give kind of more refined tests of our ideas. If you just look at the demands that are made, you see that both the communists and the non-system opposition are primarily concerned with material or economic issues. Roughly about a third of protest events focus on those issues. The communists are more interested in sort of what we call political issues, so that's personnel or appointments or public policy things, largely because they're able to be appointed to those things, and so they have interest there. And then they're also interested in historical kind of national patriotic manifestations. Whereas the non-system opposition is much more active on environmental or development issues, and on civil rights and criminal justice issues. Those are things that are largely neglected by the communists, and that's sort of what we would expect a priori just from thinking about who these organizations are. But that's just a kind of first sort of, doesn't really tell you all that much. So what we then thought about was how are we going to actually compare the protest patterns and come up with something meaningful. And so what we did was we summed the aggregate number of protest days across each region, right, and looked at the two systems. But the problem is that what we can see is whether people were protesting at the same place on the same day on the same issue. But we can't actually see whether they coordinated or not, right, from the data. So it may be that they just happened to be there by chance. Moreover, the convocations of these parliaments that was kind of our unit of analysis is they vary. And more seriously, the propensity of groups in different regions to protest varies as well. So it's hard to know exactly what to make of any given pattern, right? And I illustrate this with the example of Yaroslav. In the convocation of the regional legislature that went from 2008 to 2012, the communists protested during that convocation on 32 different days on material issues. The non-systemic opposition coordinated on 52 days. And they protested on the same day, on the same issue, 20 times during that period. And the question is that a lot or is it not, right? Does that represent a lot of coordination between the two, or does it not represent very much? What's the baseline that we would understand? Perfect, thank you. And so in order to kind of calculate, to get some idea what this baseline might be, we came up with this technique that's called randomized inference. And essentially the idea is to create a sort of, what would the world look like if they were never coordinating, but they were just going out and happened to sometimes be in the same place at the same time, right? What would the coordination patterns look like, given, conditional on the propensity of each group to protest on any given issue? And so what we did was we basically took, for each convocation and each region on each issue, we took all of the protest events and the time that they took place in, and then we randomly organized them. Sort of scattered, if you like, the protest across the days randomly. And we did that 10,000 times. And took from that the average number of days that they were protesting on the same place at the same time. So that would give you a sort of roughly baseline of what it would look like if there wasn't really much coordination going on. And then if you see them coordinating more than that, or protesting on the same place at the same time more than that, then that means that's really pretty strong evidence of coordination. And if not, then we're still not entirely sure. So this is a pretty high bar for what constitutes coordination. So this is what we did. And so this chart kind of sets out this null level of coordination. And I'll just take you through this so that you can interpret the other ones in a second. But this is the percentage of the total number of runs of our 10,000 iterations of this randomization process on different issues. What percentage of the protests on that issue would be occurring on the same day, right? So you see on the civil rights issues, for example, roughly half of the randomization resulted in no observed coordination at all, right? And a couple of percent, they ended up appearing to coordinate on every single event. And for the most part, the protests are infrequent enough that no coordination is the most common. On material issues, there's even a random protest pattern would generate the appearance of coordination on fairly frequent case. So what we do then is we then take this distribution and subtract it from what we actually observed in practice. And then this chart shows the differences, right? Essentially, if there is 0 or a negative number, this means there's no extra random coordination, so there's no real evidence of very active coordination on these issues across the groups. And where it's larger than 0, this is really substantial evidence that actual coordination is going on. And so for material demands, what we see is almost half of there's almost 50% more coordination than you could possibly get by chance. This is a pretty strong evidence that there really are actively coordinating on issues of material concern. And there's a little bit of evidence on environment and on elections and on civil rights, but not very much. So that's the basic sort of bivariate setup. We then controlled for a bunch of other things that you think might cause protests, so opposition strength, business cycle, cost of collective action, these different things. We put them all in a regression in which the dependent variable was the difference between the observed coordination and the null, the random. And then we align all of the issues up. And this table allows us to compare the coefficients between, the difference in coefficients between each of the issue areas and their statistical significance. So essentially, if it's dark, that means this issue is more likely to lead to coordination than that issue across each one of these. And what we find is that material issues are more likely to lead to coordination all across the board than any other kind of issues. This is pretty strong evidence that even in a multivariate context, our main argument holds up. Civil rights, on the other hand, is not less likely. It's sometimes negative, but in general, it's not statistically significant. So our thought that they were likely to coordinate less on civil rights stuff turns out not to be supported by the data, at least on this level. Then we also looked at the difference between places where regions that had KPRF leadership positions and places that didn't. Again, we would expect to see less coordination. So in places that have KPRF leadership, and we do find this for material demands in particular, really quite substantially less cooperation on material issues than in places where there wasn't. Some more coordination on environmental issues, which is interesting, and I don't really know why. So what's the takeaway from all of these graphs and charts and numbers and wherever? What we found is essentially that the idea that the KPRF is motivated to work actively with citizens, with its constituents on material issues, there's pretty strong evidence of that, and that they reach out to non-systemic actors and try and coordinate and work with them on those kinds of issues. That all of which is subject at the same time to trying to maintain good relations with the authorities. This suggests, at least to me, that the KPRF is not a completely boring puppet organization that just sort of takes its orders from the Kremlin, but rather is actively involved in motivating its own supporters and in placing itself intervening between them and the state, so that they become mediators between the disgruntled elements of society and the state, that prevents other actors, non-systemic actors, getting involved, poaching KPRF supporters, and also it allows the KPRF to sort of manage and de-radicalize, if you like, protest, and move it in directions that are less threatening to the state. So this is a really active role that they're playing. This is not a kind of a passive thing, and it's really quite substantial. And we see this in the protests over the housing, the demolitions in Moscow, and on other issues that have been very much in the media recently. We think sort of more broadly, this research also has implications for how we understand the role of systemic oppositions. This is not something that's been very much talked about in the literature on authoritarian regimes. They're ubiquitous, but we tend to focus much more in political science, at least on institutions, on the role of things like parliaments and elections, and not much on the strategy and the function of opposition parties. And what we find is that these systemic parties, their job is actually not just to sort of keep seats warm in the parliament, but actually they're out there in society actively working with core constituencies. And this, I think, will probably have a pretty important stabilizing effects on authoritarianism throughout the world in comparative perspective. But on the other hand, it also means that when incumbents have really serious problems with issues that are of core concern to systemic opposition, then that's probably when they're likely to be at their most vulnerable. So, thank you.